Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're looking into gangs, but from a different angle than you might be used to.
Yes, exactly. We're kind of going beyond the sensationalized headlines and really trying to dig into some of the complexities and nuances of gangs in the 21st century.
Yeah, and to do that, we're going to be looking at 3 different YouTube videos that you shared with me. Each one kind of takes a slightly different angle.
Yeah, they do. And it's a really interesting mix. One is actually in French, and it focuses on a specific gang, the Nietas.
Okay.
And it looks at their global reach, their leadership structure, even their communication practices.
Interesting.
Another video explores the economic power of criminal gangs worldwide, talking about just how much revenue they generate annually,
Wow.
and even proposes a pretty controversial solution, legalization.
Oh, legalization. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So we've got kind of a global gang of a financial angle. And what about the third video?
Yeah, the third one takes a more kind of academic approach, I guess you could say,
Okay.
and it looks at how the study of gangs has evolved over time, particularly in light of globalization.
Okay.
It challenges traditional notions of gang activity and encourages us to kind of rethink our understanding of these groups.
So our mission today is to unpack all of this, the global reach, the economics, the changing nature of gangs, to kind of move beyond stereotypes and really understand how they operate in our interconnected world.
Absolutely.
So to do that, I think we need to start with a very basic question. What is a gang?
Right.
Because I have a feeling it's a lot more complicated than just a group of people wearing matching jackets.
You're absolutely right. And actually, that's one of the key takeaways, I think, from all of these sources is that there's no single universally agreed upon definition of a gang. Even researchers and law enforcement struggle with this,
So how do we even approach this then? Where do we even start if the very definition is so slippery?
Well, I mean, one of the videos kind of traces the evolution of the term gang back to, early American studies like Thrasher's work on Chicago gangs in the 1920s.
Okay.
Back then, the focus was very much on social factors, the local contexts that led to the formation of these groups.
So different cities, different neighborhoods, different pressures that might push young people towards gangs. It's about understanding those unique circumstances.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Over time, that focus has shifted, particularly in recent decades, towards, the economic power and global reach of gangs.
Right.
We're talking about activities like drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms dealing. These are transnational activities that require sophisticated networks and generate massive wealth.
Which brings us back to that, I think it was $1 trillion figure you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, something like that.
It's mind-boggling to think about the kind of money these organizations are moving around the world.
It is, yeah.
But is it all about the money? That are gangs simply criminal enterprises?
That's where things get really interesting, because the sources also highlight a tension between viewing gangs as purely criminal organizations versus acknowledging their potential social and political roles, especially in marginalized communities.
So in some cases, they might be filling a void left by the state, providing a sense of belonging, protection, even a form of social order, however distorted that people aren't getting elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And this kind of leads us to our case study, the Nietas.
Okay.
One of the videos dives deep into this transnational gang, offering a glimpse into how these complex dynamics play out on a global scale.
Okay, so tell me more about the Nietas. Where did they come from and how did they become this global force?
So the Nietas actually originated in the prisons of Puerto Rico in the early 1980s. They were born out of violence and a desire for power within the prison system.
Okay.
And they were also influenced by the political ideology of a prisoner named Carlos La Slambra, who was a former leader of a group with ties to the Puerto Rican Socialist Party.
So there was this political undercurrent from the very start.
Yeah, absolutely.
But how did they go from Puerto Rican prisons to a global presence?
Migration played a huge role in the early 1990s. You had a lot of Puerto Ricans migrating to New York City, and among them were members of the Nietas.
Okay.
This movement essentially transplanted their operations onto a new landscape.
So they were following established migration routes, bringing their organization and activities with them?
Exactly. And some of these migrants ended up in New York prisons, including Rikers Island, where they began to rebuild their organization.
Interesting.
By the mid-1990s, they had a significant presence on the streets of New York, involved in the drug trade, particularly during the crack epidemic.
So it wasn't just a matter of individuals moving, it was the structure and the operations of the gang itself migrating along with them.
Yeah, and this pattern repeated itself as the Nietas expanded to other parts of the U.S. and eventually to Latin America and Europe.
So they really did become this transnational force. But if they're a global organization, how do they maintain cohesion and control across different locations?
That's a crucial question, and it brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the Nietas, their leadership structure.
Okay.
They have a leader, Maximo, or supreme leader, who's actually imprisoned in Puerto Rico.
Imprisoned, how can someone effectively lead a global organization from behind bars?
It's a remarkable case study in the interplay of distance and presence.
Okay.
Despite his physical confinement, the leader, Maximo, maintains his authority through letters, communication networks, and a carefully cultivated mystique.
So even though he's physically isolated, he's still the ultimate authority figure, issuing directives and shaping the gang's activities from his prison cell.
Yes, and the French video really highlights this. It features a local leader in Barcelona writing a letter to the leader, Maximo, seeking permission to change a gang rule.
Wow.
He goes through intermediaries, demonstrating the importance of this hierarchical chain of command.
It's almost like a king issuing decrees from his royal court, but in this case, the court is a prison cell. It's a fascinating example of how traditional methods of communication can still hold power in a digital age, but is this centralized authority do local leaders have any autonomy?
That's a great question, and something we'll explore further in our next segment. The Nietas' leadership structure is a delicate balance between centralized authority and decentralized leadership, and that balance is key to understanding how they operate effectively on a global scale.
So we've established that the Nietas have this fascinating leadership structure, but I'm curious about the day-to-day realities, of running a global gang. Like, what does that actually look like? How do they manage operations across different countries and continents?
Well, a big part of that comes down to economics. These organizations need resources to function, and that means generating revenue. And one of the videos we're diving into today highlights this by sharing a pretty startling statistic from the UN.
Okay.
Criminal gangs worldwide generate an estimated $870 billion annually.
Wow, that's more than the GDP of many countries. It's hard to even wrap my head around a number that big.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But how are they making all that money? What are their main sources of income?
Two major revenue streams stand out: drug trafficking and human trafficking. Both are horrific, of course, but incredibly lucrative on the global black market.
It's a tragic reality that human suffering fuels such massive profits.
Yeah.
But it does raise a challenging question. What can be done to disrupt these criminal enterprises? One of the videos we're looking at proposes a controversial solution: legalization. How could making something legal actually reduce gang activity?
It seems counterintuitive at first glance, right? But the argument draws parallels to the Prohibition era in the U.S. when alcohol was outlawed. It didn't eliminate drinking.
Right.
It simply pushed it underground, creating a massive black market that organized crime was all too happy to fill.
So you're saying that by trying to ban something, you might inadvertently create the perfect conditions for criminal organizations to thrive.
Exactly. Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking. It just made it more dangerous and profitable for criminals. And the argument is that we're seeing a similar dynamic with drugs today.
Okay.
By criminalizing certain substances, we've created a global black market controlled by powerful gangs who use violence to enforce their dominance.
So the idea is that by legalizing and regulating certain drugs, you could take away a major source of income for these gangs, effectively cutting off their financial lifeline.
That's the core of the argument. By bringing these activities out of the shadows and into a regulated framework, you could potentially reduce violence, generate tax revenue, and shift the focus from criminalization to public health.
It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts, but the historical parallel with prohibition is definitely food for thought.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if sometimes our attempts to control behavior through prohibition can backfire and create even bigger problems.
And it's crucial to remember that this isn't a black and white issue. There are valid arguments on both sides of the legalization debate.
Of course, yeah.
The point the video raises is that it's a conversation worth having, especially when we're trying to find effective ways to address the power and influence of global criminal organizations.
Right, there are no easy answers here, but I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea that gangs can play a role in political power dynamics, particularly in areas with weak governance or ongoing conflicts. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Absolutely. One of the videos highlighted the fact that gangs often thrive in environments where the state is weak or absent, particularly in regions affected by separatist movements or torn states. They can exploit the chaos and power vacuums that emerge in these situations.
So they're not just about making money, they can become actors in these larger political struggles.
Precisely. They can act as allies to separatist movements, providing manpower, resources, control over illicit markets. Or they can play different factions against each other, leveraging their influence for their own gain. It's a complex web of alliances and rivalries where the lines between criminal activity and political maneuvering can become very blurred.
It's a stark reminder that the impact of gangs goes far beyond just street crime. They can be woven into the very fabric of a society, influencing everything from local politics to global economies. But this brings us back to the earlier point about the evolving nature of gangs. How has globalization shaped these organizations and their activities?
Globalization has had a profound impact on gangs, both in terms of their reach and their evolution. One of the videos we're looking at today emphasizes how globalization has facilitated the spread of gang culture symbols and even organizational models across borders.
So it's not just people and goods moving across borders anymore, it's ideas and ways of operating as well.
Exactly, and this cultural exchange can have unexpected consequences. The video points out that in some countries, the adoption of American-style zero-tolerance policing strategies, which are often touted as a way to combat gangs, has actually had the opposite effect.
How? So I would think cracking down on gangs would help to reduce their influence.
It seems logical on the surface, but when you criminalize and marginalize entire communities, you often create the perfect breeding ground for gangs to recruit and thrive. Young people who feel targeted and alienated by the system might be more likely to seek out the sense of belonging and protection that a gang offers, even if it comes with a heavy price.
It's a reminder that solutions that focus solely on punishment and enforcement can sometimes backfire and exacerbate the very problems they're trying to solve.
And it highlights the need for a more nuanced approach, one that addresses the root causes of gang involvement, such as poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity. But there's another aspect of globalization that's changing the landscape of gangs technology.
That makes sense. The internet and social media have transformed the way we communicate and connect with each other. I imagine that has implications for how gangs operate as well.
Absolutely. Social media has become a powerful tool for recruitment communication. And even intimidation gangs can use it to project an image of power and influence to spread their message and to connect with potential recruits who might be vulnerable to their appeals.
It's almost like gangs have gone digital, leveraging the same tools that businesses and organizations use to connect with audiences and build their brands.
That's a great analogy, and it underscores the fact that gangs are constantly evolving and adapting, finding new ways to operate and thrive in a changing world. But the video also points out another intriguing trend: the blurring of lines between criminal activity and political activism.
Can you give me an example of what that looks like in practice?
In some cases, gangs have started incorporating political rhetoric into their messaging, aligning themselves with broader social movements, or even engaging in activities that have a political dimension.
So it's not always clear-cut who's a criminal and who's a political actor.
Exactly. Those lines can become very blurry, making it more challenging to define and respond to these groups. It raises important questions about motivation, ideology, and the role of gangs in shaping social and political landscapes.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on this issue, but I also realize that this is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn and explore.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? This deep dive has provided a framework, some key insights, and hopefully sparked your curiosity. Now it's up to you to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep expanding your understanding of this complex and ever-evolving world.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the historical roots of gangs to their complex operations in a globalized world. And I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how these organizations function. But I'm also left with a lot of questions like, what does it all mean? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think it's clear that, gangs are not this monolithic entity, easily categorized and dismissed. They're dynamic, they're adaptable, they're woven into the fabric of societies all around the world.
Yeah.
And as we've seen, they're constantly evolving, influenced by everything from globalization and technology to political instability and social inequalities.
So what's the takeaway here? How do we even begin to address a problem that's so deeply rooted and multifaceted?
Well, one of the key insights I think that emerged from these videos is that simplistic solutions like relying solely on law enforcement and punishment are unlikely to be effective in the long run. In fact, as we discussed earlier, those heavy-handed tactics can sometimes backfire, create more problems than they solve.
You mentioned the unintended consequences of zero-tolerance policing. It seems like we need a more holistic approach, one that addresses the underlying factors that contribute to gang involvement in the first place. But what would that look like in practice?
Well, one of the videos touched on a really crucial point, providing legitimate economic opportunities and pathways to social mobility, especially for marginalized youth, can be a really powerful deterrent to gang involvement.
It's about giving people a real chance at a better life, a reason to choose a different path. But it can't just be about economics, right? We also talked about the social and psychological factors that draw people to gangs.
Absolutely. It's also about, addressing social exclusion and fostering a sense of belonging. Gangs often thrive in environments where people feel disconnected, marginalized, lacking a sense of purpose. So creating a more inclusive society where everyone feels valued and has a stake is essential.
It sounds like we need this kind of multi-pronged approach that tackles this issue from all angles: economic opportunity, social inclusion, addressing systemic inequalities, and yes, law enforcement strategies that focus on reducing violence and holding individuals accountable.
Exactly. It's about breaking down the problem into its component parts
Yeah.
and developing strategies that target each of those areas. It's not going to be easy and it won't happen overnight, but by taking a more nuanced and comprehensive approach, we can start to chip away at this complex web of factors that contribute to gang activity.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on this issue, but I also realize that this is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn and explore.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? I mean, this deep dive has provided a framework, some key insights, and hopefully spark your curiosity. Now it's up to you to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep expanding your understanding of this complex and ever-evolving world.
Well said. And on that note, dear listeners, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have. But before we sign off, we always like to leave you with a final thought, something to ponder as you go about your day.
Given all that we've discussed, here's a question for you to consider. If we really want to effectively address the challenges posed by gangs, do we need to shift our focus from simply trying to eliminate them to understanding the complex social, economic, and political factors that contribute to their existence? Could focusing on empowering individuals and strengthening communities be a more effective long-term strategy than relying solely on law enforcement and criminalization?
It's a complex question, but one that's definitely worth wrestling with. And with that, we leave you to ponder this and continue your own explorations. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.